The thing about apex predators, the narrator mused with considerable amusement, is that they tend to get a little overconfident. Take the Velthak Empire, for instance. These particular specimens had been stomping around the galaxy for the better part of 3 centuries, collecting what they so charmingly called cubs from primitive worlds. Oh, they had it down to a science, really. Drop in with overwhelming firepower, scoop up the young ones before the adults could mount any meaningful resistance, and zip off to the nearest slave market. Simple, efficient, profitable. Commander Kalneth stood on the bridge of his raider vessel, the Bone Harvest, watching the blue-green world of New Haven spin lazily below. His mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he reviewed the intelligence reports. Humans, barely past their industrial age, scattered across frontier colonies with laughably primitive defense systems. The settlement below housed maybe 3,000 souls, including what his scouts estimated to be nearly 200 younglings. Perfect harvesting conditions. "Sir," his tactical officer buzzed through the comm, "preliminary scans show minimal military presence. A few kinetic weapons, some basic energy shields. Nothing that should pose a challenge to our assault craft." Kalneth's laugh was a wet, chittering sound that would have made most species reconsider their life choices. "Of course not, Lieutenant. These mammals are barely out of their caves. Deploy the standard harvest protocol. I want those cubs loaded and secured within the hour." What Kalneth didn't know, and really how could he, was that New Haven's defense coordinator happened to be one Katrina Valdez, a woman whose military engineering background had been forged in the crucible of humanity's various corporate wars. She'd come to New Haven seeking peace and quiet, hoping to help build something beautiful instead of tearing things apart for a change. The universe, as it turned out, had other plans. Katrina was in the middle of calibrating the colony's early warning sensors when every alarm in the settlement started screaming at once. She bolted upright from her console, her coffee mug, thankfully empty, clattering to the floor as the distinctive energy signatures of Velthak assault craft painted themselves across her displays. "Well," she muttered, her fingers flying over the emergency protocols, "there goes the neighborhood." The attack came with typical Velthak efficiency. Plasma bolts rained down on the settlement's outer defenses while sleek assault craft swooped low over the residential districts. Katrina watched from the command bunker as squads of armored raiders began methodically herding civilians toward collection points. Her jaw tightened as she realized their targeting pattern. They were going straight for the schools, the playgrounds, anywhere children might be found, including the community center where her 8-year-old nephew Lucas was supposed to be attending his art class. Katrina's hands moved with practiced precision, activating what few defensive measures the colony possessed. Energy barriers flickered to life around critical infrastructure, and the settlement's modest complement of pulse cannons began their futile resistance. She knew it wouldn't be enough. Hell, it wouldn't even slow them down significantly, but it might buy precious minutes for evacuation protocols. The comm crackled with panicked voices as colonists reported raider movements throughout the settlement. Katrina filtered through the chaos, trying to coordinate what resistance she could while her heart hammered against her ribs. Every report of captured children felt like a physical blow, but she forced herself to maintain tactical focus. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Katrina!" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, one of the colony's civilian administrators. "They've breached the community center. I can see them loading children into transport pods." Her blood turned to ice. "Lucas." She abandoned her post without hesitation, grabbing her sidearm and sprinting toward the community center through streets that had become a war zone. Plasma fire lit up the evening sky, while Velthak raiders moved with the casual confidence of predators collecting helpless prey. She reached the community center just in time to see Lucas being marched toward a transport pod with a dozen other children. Her nephew's face was streaked with tears, but he wasn't crying, a stubborn trait that apparently ran in the family. Their eyes met across the burning courtyard, and she saw his mouth form her name. Katrina raised her weapon, knowing even as she did that it was hopeless. The raider escort was too heavily armored, the distance too great, and there were simply too many of them. She fired anyway, because sometimes hopeless gestures were all you had left. Her shot sparked harmlessly off Velthak armor as the transport pod sealed shut and lifted into the darkening sky. The main raider vessel hung above the colony like a metallic thundercloud, its cargo bays swallowing transport after transport filled with New Haven's children. Katrina stood in the smoldering ruins of the community center, watching her nephew disappear into the belly of that beast, and felt something cold and deadly settle into her chest. Commander Kalneth reviewed the harvest reports with the satisfaction of a job well done. 236 cubs collected, minimal casualties among his forces, and the entire operation completed in under 2 hours. The humans had put up token resistance, but nothing remotely threatening. Just the usual pathetic flailing of primitives watching their young being claimed by their betters. "Set course for the Nexus Station slave markets," he ordered, settling back into his command throne. "Signal the buyers that we have fresh stock, including a new species that should fetch premium prices." The bone harvest turned away from New Haven's ravaged surface and began its journey toward the jump point. In the ship's holding bays, human children huddled together with alien cubs from a dozen other species, all destined for lives of servitude among the stars. It was, Kalneth reflected, simply the natural order of things. The strong took from the weak, and the weak learned to accept their place. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that one of those weak primitives was already formulating a plan that would turn his natural order upside down and inside out. Back on New Haven's surface, Katrina stood in her devastated command center, studying the sensor readings from the Velthak ship. Her engineering mind was already working, cataloging the vessel's energy signatures, analyzing its shield harmonics, noting the patterns of its escort craft. She'd spent enough time reverse engineering alien technology to recognize opportunity when she saw it. The colonists expected her to call for help, to send distress signals to Earth Command and pray that a rescue fleet might arrive in time. That was the reasonable thing to do, the smart thing, the thing any sane person would do when faced with overwhelming odds. Katrina had never been accused of being particularly reasonable. She began pulling up schematics of the settlement's industrial fabricators, her mind already racing through possibilities. The Velthak had taken her nephew, along with every other child in the colony. They thought they were dealing with helpless primitives who would cower and weep while their young were stolen. They were about to learn that humans didn't cower nearly as easily as they thought, and more importantly, they were about to discover that some things were worth dying for. But more interesting still, some things were worth making other people die for. The hunt was about to begin, and for once, the predators weren't going to be the ones doing the hunting. The bone harvest was, Katrina had to admit as she clung to its hull 3 days later, an impressively ugly piece of engineering. The Velthak clearly subscribed to the function over form school of starship design, which meant the vessel looked like someone had taken a bunch of industrial machinery and welded it together during a particularly unimaginative fever dream. Fortunately for her current predicament, it also meant the ship was riddled with maintenance access ports, sensor blind spots, and enough external piping to provide handholds for one determined human with a salvaged EVA suit, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Getting here had been the easy part, relatively speaking. Katrina had spent 2 sleepless days cobbling together a pursuit craft from New Haven's mining equipment and what remained of their defensive systems. The result looked like a flying scrapyard and handled about as well as you'd expect, but it had gotten her close enough to the raider ship to attempt what any reasonable person would have called an elaborate suicide. The hard part, as it turned out, was getting inside without triggering every security system the Velthak had ever installed. "Right," she muttered into her helmet comm, watching her oxygen levels with the sort of casual interest usually reserved for impending doom. "Let's see what passes for subtle around here." The maintenance hatch she'd chosen was tucked between 2 massive engine nacelles, presumably because even Velthak engineers had enough sense to make critical repairs accessible. her improvised cutting tool, a delightful combination of human ingenuity and alien power cells that probably violated several laws of physics, made quick work of the outer seals. The interior of the ship was exactly as welcoming as she'd expected. Red lighting bathed everything in a color that suggested either emergency conditions or questionable interior design choices. The corridors were too tall for humans and too narrow for comfort, lined with conduits that hummed with barely contained energy. It was, Katrina reflected, the sort of place where nightmares went to feel cozy. She moved through the ship with the careful precision of someone who understood that one wrong turn could result in either capture or explosive decompression. Her stolen Velthak scanner, another souvenir from New Haven's brief but exciting alien invasion, painted a rough schematic of the vessel's layout across her visor. The holding areas were 3 decks down, which meant navigating through what appeared to be a maze designed by someone with a grudge against logical navigation. The first signs of the ship's true purpose became apparent when she reached the detention levels. The air here carried sounds that made her jaw clench. Not screaming, which might have been easier to handle, but the soft whimpering of young voices trying very hard to be brave. It was the sound of children who had learned that crying brought unwanted attention from their captors. Katrina followed the sounds through a series of interconnected chambers that served as the Velthak's idea of a training facility. What she found there made her reevaluate several assumptions about the nature of evil in the universe. The main holding area was divided into species-specific sections, each designed to break young minds through a carefully calibrated combination of fear, isolation, and psychological conditioning. Human children occupied one corner, huddled together for warmth and comfort. But they weren't alone. Alien cubs from a dozen different species filled the other sections. Small, frightened beings with fur, scales, or carapaces, all united by the universal language of terror. And there, in the human section, was Lucas. Her nephew sat with his back against the wall, his arm around a younger girl who was trying very hard not to cry. He'd always been protective of smaller kids, a trait that had gotten him into trouble at school, back on Earth. Here, surrounded by the aftermath of interstellar kidnapping, it made him look older than his 8 years. Katrina forced herself to observe before acting, cataloging everything she could about the facility's operation. The guards were minimal. Apparently, the Velthak didn't consider traumatized children much of a security risk. Automated systems monitored the holding areas, dispensing nutrition paste and basic medical care while psychological conditioning programs played on wall-mounted displays. What caught her attention, though, was the way the alien cubs reacted to the humans. Instead of the species-specific isolation the Velthak had intended, the children had begun forming mixed groups. A small creature with iridescent scales sat next to Lucas, while a fuzzy mammalian cub shared its meager food ration with one of the human girls. Apparently, the Velthak had made a fundamental error in their understanding of how young minds worked. Children, it seemed, were considerably more adaptable than their captors had anticipated. Katrina waited until the guard rotation changed before making her move. The facility's security was designed to keep children in, not to prevent determined adults from getting to them. She slipped through the detention area's outer perimeter with the sort of ease that really should have embarrassed a supposedly advanced civilization. Lucas looked up as she approached, his eyes widening with a sort of joy that made 3 days of desperate planning worthwhile. But before he could speak, she pressed a finger to her lips and settled down beside him. "Aunt Cat?" he whispered, barely audible above the facility's ambient hum. "Hey, kiddo," she murmured back, pulling him into a quick embrace. "Miss me?" The reunion was necessarily brief. Katrina quickly explained that she was here to get them out, but that it would take time and careful planning. More importantly, she began to realize that them meant more than just the human children. The alien cub sitting next to Lucas turned out to be named Nul, a young member of a species called the Fentai, who had been captured during a raid on his homeworld 6 months earlier. Despite the language barrier, he'd apparently bonded with the human children through their shared misery, and their mutual determination not to let their captors break them. "He's been teaching us things," Lucas whispered as Newell watched them with large, intelligent eyes. "About the ship, about the guards. He's really smart." Katrina studied the young alien with new interest. The Fentai were known for their technical aptitude, but she hadn't expected to find that kind of strategic thinking in someone so young. Then again, desperate circumstances had a way of bringing out unexpected capabilities. Over the next several hours, Katrina began to understand the true scope of what she was dealing with. The Velthak conditioning programs were designed to break individual will and foster dependence on their captors. But the children had unconsciously begun to resist by forming supportive communities that crossed species lines. They shared food, comfort, and most importantly, information. Newell, despite his age, had spent months observing the ship's operations. He knew guard schedules, understood the basic layout of critical systems, and had even figured out how to access some of the facility's learning terminals. The human children, meanwhile, had proven remarkably adaptable to alien technology and social structures. As Katrina watched them interact, a plan began to form in her mind. It was ambitious, risky, and probably insane. It was also, she realized, their best chance not just of escape, but of turning the tables on their captors entirely. The Velthak thought they were harvesting helpless cubs. They had no idea they'd accidentally assembled the raw materials for their own downfall. "All right, kids," Katrina said quietly, gathering the human children around her while Newell translated for some of the alien cubs. "How would you like to learn something that's going to make our hosts very, very unhappy?" The smiles that answered her question were sharp enough to cut metal. Apparently, trauma had a way of bringing out the predator in even the youngest humans. And as she was about to discover, properly motivated alien cubs could be just as dangerous. The Velthak were about to learn that there were worse things than angry adult humans. Like angry adult humans with time to plan and a pack of vengeful children to teach. The thing about underestimating children, Katrina reflected as she watched 8-year-old Lucas demonstrate the finer points of sabotage to a fascinated audience of alien cubs, is that adults tend to forget how quickly young minds adapt to new circumstances, especially when those circumstances involve turning their captor's own ship into a playground of controlled chaos. It had been a week since she'd begun what she privately called Insurgency 101 for the under-10 set, and the results were frankly spectacular. The human children had taken to guerrilla tactics with the enthusiasm typically reserved for video games and candy, while the alien cubs brought natural abilities that the Velthak had never bothered to consider dangerous in young specimens. Take Newell, for instance. The young Fentai had an intuitive understanding of the ship's computer systems that would have made human engineers weep with envy. More importantly, he'd figured out how to access the learning terminals without triggering security protocols, a skill that Katrina was putting to exceptionally good use. "Remember," she whispered to her unlikely class of students, "we're not trying to break everything at once. We want the ship to develop problems gradually, like it's just getting old and cranky." The children nodded with the sort of solemn attention usually reserved for sacred rituals, which, in a way, this was. Katrina had turned their daily conditioning sessions into cover for advanced lessons in creative destruction, using the Velthak's own psychological manipulation tools to teach resistance instead of compliance. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. The ship's automated systems expected certain behavioral patterns from their young prisoners: compliance, fear, gradual psychological breakdown. Instead, they were getting something far more interesting: a coordinated campaign of systematic rebellion disguised as random malfunctions. Lucas had become her unofficial lieutenant among the human children, his natural leadership abilities sharpened by weeks of captivity and a burning desire for revenge. He'd taken to the lessons with the focused intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the difference between escape and spending the rest of his life in chains. "Aunt Cat," he whispered during one of their planning sessions, Null says he found something weird in the ship's memory banks. Katrina turned to the young Fen Tai, who was hunched over a learning terminal with the expression of someone who discovered something both fascinating and disturbing. His translation came through Lucas, who'd picked up enough of Null's language to serve as an interpreter. He says the ship's central computer has access to the navigation systems, Lucas continued, his eyes wide with possibility. And the communication arrays, and the life support controls. The implications hit Katrina like a physical blow. The Velthak, in their arrogance, had connected their prisoner conditioning systems to the ship's primary networks. Presumably, they'd never imagined that their captives might be capable of anything more sophisticated than crying and begging for their parents. They were about to learn the error of that assumption in the most dramatic way possible. Commander Kalneth was beginning to suspect that his latest harvest was cursed. Over the past week, the bone harvest had developed an alarming tendency toward mechanical failure. Nothing catastrophic, just a steady accumulation of minor problems that kept his maintenance crews scrambling and his engineers muttering about statistical impossibilities. First, it had been the food dispensers in the detention areas, which had begun producing nutrition paste with creative variations in flavor and consistency. Then the environmental controls had started experiencing random fluctuations, making certain sections of the ship uncomfortably warm or cold. Most recently, the ship's internal communication system had developed an annoying habit of routing calls to the wrong departments. "Sir," his chief engineer reported with the weary tone of someone who'd spent the last 3 days chasing phantoms through the ship's systems. "We've run full diagnostics on every affected system. Everything checks out perfectly. The computers insist that nothing is wrong." Kalneth's mandibles clicked with irritation. "Then explain why my personal quarters were flooded with coolant this morning." "The system logs show a routine maintenance cycle, sir. According to the computer, it was performing scheduled maintenance on the climate control systems. The fact that it happened at 0300 hours while you were sleeping appears to be coincidental." The word coincidental was delivered with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested the engineer had his own suspicions about the nature of these malfunctions. Kalneth studied the maintenance reports with growing unease. Individually, each incident could be explained as random mechanical failure. Collectively, they painted a pattern that made his warrior instincts twitch with alarm. Meanwhile, 3 decks below, Katrina was conducting the most unusual military briefing of her career. Her assembled strike force consisted of 24 children representing 6 different species, armed with nothing more dangerous than curiosity and a growing understanding of how to make their captors' lives miserable. "Phase 2 begins tomorrow," she announced quietly, watching as Lucas translated for the alien cubs while Null worked his magic on the learning terminal's security protocols. "We've established that we can cause problems without getting caught. Now we escalate." The children leaned forward with the sort of eager attention that would have warmed any teacher's heart if that teacher happened to be planning the overthrow of an interstellar kidnapping operation. "Null has found us a way into the ship's primary systems," Katrina continued. "We're going to use it to send a message, but not the kind our hosts are expecting." The young Fentai looked up from his terminal, chittering something that made several of the alien cubs perk up with interest. Lucas grinned as he translated. "He says he can make the ship tell everyone where we are," the boy announced. "And who took us, and exactly what they were planning to do with us." Katrina smiled, and it was the sort of expression that would have made Commander Kalneth reconsider his career choices if he'd been there to see it. The Velthak had made 2 critical errors. First, they'd assumed that human children would be as easy to break as their usual victims. Second, they'd never considered that teaching alien cubs to work with human children might be the most dangerous mistake in the history of interstellar kidnapping. They were about to discover just how expensive those assumptions could be. The revolution began at 0347 ship time with what Commander Kalneth would later describe in his testimony as the most humiliating military defeat in Velthak history. Not that he was particularly eager to discuss the details, mind you, but the various species war crimes tribunals had very specific ideas about the importance of accurate record keeping. It started, as most disasters do, with something seemingly insignificant. The ship's internal lights began flickering in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Then the air recycling systems started playing what could only be described as music, a haunting melody that none of the Velthak crew recognized, but which made the alien cubs in detention perk up with sudden hope. Katrina smiled as she listened to the Fentai freedom song echoing through the ship's corridors. Newell had suggested it as a signal to begin the final phase, and she had to admit the kid had flair for dramatic timing. "All right, everyone," she whispered to her assembled army of vengeful children. "Time to show our hosts what happens when you pick on the wrong cubs." What followed was less a battle than a masterpiece of coordinated chaos. The human children, armed with Katrina's technical knowledge and their own frightening adaptability, began systematically dismantling the ship's critical systems. Meanwhile, the alien cubs deployed natural abilities that the Velthak had never bothered to catalog as potentially dangerous. Newell, it turned out, could interface directly with computer systems through bioelectric fields that his species used for communication. The young Fentai had spent weeks learning the ship's control languages, and now he unleashed that knowledge with the focused vengeance of someone who'd had months to plan his revenge. The Velthak crew's first indication that something was seriously wrong came when their weapons systems locked them out with a message that read, in 17 different languages, "Sorry, but these are for grown-ups only." Commander Kalneth stormed onto the bridge to find his tactical officers staring at displays that showed their entire arsenal was now under external control. "Sir," the officer reported with the sort of careful calm that preceded complete panic, "our weapons are targeting us." Before Kalneth could respond, every screen on the bridge lit up with the face of a human female who looked like she'd been having the best day of her life. "Good morning, gentlemen," Katrina announced cheerfully from what appeared to be his own ready room. "I'm Commander Valdez of the Human Colonial Defense Force, and I'll be your nightmare for this evening." The truth was, Katrina had never held any rank higher than lieutenant, and the Human Colonial Defense Force existed mainly in her imagination. But the Velthak didn't need to know that, and confidence was 90% of successful bluffing. "You will release our vessels immediately," Kalneth snarled at the screen. "You are criminals who have violated—" "Oh, I'm sorry," Katrina interrupted with mock concern. "Did I break your kidnapping schedule? How inconsiderate of me." Her expression shifted to something considerably less friendly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit down, shut up, and listen while I explain your new situation." As if to emphasize her point, the bridge's environmental controls suddenly decided that the command deck needed to be approximately 20 degrees warmer. Kalneth found himself sweating inside his armor while his crew frantically tried to regain control of their own ship. "Your vessel is now under the command of 36 children representing 9 different species," Katrina continued conversationally. "Your weapons are aimed at your own engines. Your life support is running on our goodwill. And most importantly, your communication array is currently broadcasting a detailed confession of your crimes to every civilized world within 50 light years." The final twist came when Lucas appeared on screen beside his aunt, grinning with the sort of satisfaction usually reserved for successfully completed homework assignments. "Hi, Commander," he said brightly. "My name is Lucas, and you kidnapped me. Just wanted you to know that was a really, really bad idea." Behind him, alien cubs from half a dozen species waved at the bridge cameras, while human children operated control stations with the casual competence of seasoned naval officers. It was, Kalneth realized with growing horror, the most professionally executed mutiny he'd ever witnessed. The coup de grace came when Newell appeared on screen, chittering something that made the alien cubs cheer while Lucas provided translation. "He says to tell you that his people's fleet should be here in about 20 minutes, along with ships from, a lot of other species who are really, really unhappy about what you've been doing." Katrina's smile could have powered a small star. "The thing about humans, Commander, is that we don't just protect our own pack. We protect any pack worth protecting. And these kids, they're all worth protecting. When the rescue fleets arrived, they found the bone harvest drifting peacefully in space, its crew locked in their own brig, while children from 9 different species shared alien candy and taught each other games from their homeworlds. The Velthak raiders, meanwhile, were discovering that there were worse fates than death, like explaining to a coalition of very angry parents exactly why they'd thought kidnapping children was a profitable career choice. The galaxy learned something important that day. Never underestimate a human with nothing left to lose. But more importantly, never underestimate what happens when that human decides to teach everyone else's cubs how to bite back. Some lessons, after all, are worth sharing.